We're going to have a conversation here today about education writ large, the way it is, problems with the way it is, the way it might be, the way it should be. We're very fortunate to have some very distinguished members of this panel to contribute to this conversation, so I'd like to begin by having the panel members introduce themselves, and then I'll throw out a very general question and we'll see what people have to say. So I'm Stephen Koslin. I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. And to my left.
My name is Adam Weinberg. I'm the president and CEO of World Learning.
I'm Susan.
Sure.
What World Learning is?
Yeah, just a little bit of the 2-second stump speech about World Learning. We run education programs in about 75 countries around the world. So we do everything from training teachers in Ethiopia to building STEM schools in Egypt, to sending young Americans on semester-long international programs. Many people in this room may know us as either the Experiment in International Living or the School for International Training.
My name is Susan Polgar, and I had a long and successful competitive career in chess. And for the past little over a decade, I've been going to the other side of things in promoting chess as an educational tool. And currently I'm with Webster University, promoting chess and using chess as an educational tool.
My name is Fred Mednick. I'm the head of Teachers Without Borders, and that focuses on connecting education and international development initiatives around the world. I'm also a visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Ed.
My name is Vincent Aleven. I'm an associate professor in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. For my research, I investigate how people learn and how we can help them be better learners. And I also create advanced learning technologies such as intelligent tutoring systems. And more recently, I'm working on educational games. And over the years, I've done my research mostly in schools, in fact, at all levels, from kindergarten through law school and everything in between.
Hi, I'm Howard Gardner. I'm a psychologist at Harvard, probably best known for a theory of multiple intelligences. For the last 20 years, I've been focusing on professional ethics, particularly how do professions survive at times when markets are very powerful. But I was absolutely delighted to see the description of this panel because I've become tremendously interested in these issues of arts, humanities, and even science surviving in higher education in light of the very powerful disruptive tendencies which are roiling higher education. So I'm glad to be on this panel.
Well, thank you. Let's start off by talking about the humanities, which are widely acknowledged to be in crisis currently. I was interested to read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, where in it he repeatedly noted that Steve Jobs thought that what he was doing was combining the humanities with technology. He thought that had a lot to do with his success. So I'd like to know from the panel, what do you think someone like Jobs probably meant by the humanities? And is what's taught in humanities departments and universities the same kind of thing that Jobs was drawing on to make his products so appealing and easy to use? And can what was done at Apple be accomplished more broadly? Can it be applied to other kinds of technologies and beyond technology? And in general, what should be the role of the humanities at different stages of education? Any of you have any thoughts about any of this? Howard.
Oh, I'm happy to start this off. I don't think it pays to try to figure out exactly what Steve Jobs meant. Yeah, obviously, probably everybody here has read the book. Jobs' interest in design and how people would feel about the products and how they would relate to their lives in ways which they might not know until they run into an Apple product. I think that's probably as far as I would go in trying to deconstruct what he meant. Traditionally, humanities has been thought of as the ways in which people learn about the best ideas that have been thought and written before the present time. And so it's basically philosophy, history, literature, maybe the arts, probably not design, which I think is part what Steve Jobs was talking about. But let me allude to two things which I think would be helpful. When Bill Hazeltine was speaking this morning, I think some of you heard that, he talked about how the problems that he tackled as a scientist really were both motivated by and ultimately guided by the wide reading that he had done and his interest in art, and the questions which came up as a result of his being a collector of knowledge of all sorts. And he was critiquing the notion that the best way to make a scientist is just to teach them all previous science. And I really resonated to that. But let me tell you something that happened a couple years ago to me, which made an impression on me, and I hope on you. I was talking about education to a group, and a student, quite bright and even more self-assured, came up to me and said, "I don't know why we need to have school anymore when the answers to all questions are contained in this smartphone." And I said to him, yes, the answer to all the questions except the important ones. And I think that's what humanistic studies are about, and that's what liberal arts is about as well. And I would include sciences in liberal arts, but sciences in terms of asking big questions and always asking further questions in the way that Hazeltine meant.
You're looking at me? As a former principal, you know, I know that look. Well, I want to pick up where Howard left off, because I keep on thinking about defining this word humanities in the context of daily life and classrooms, and why so much of this is under attack. And I guess I remember reading something from Alfred North Whitehead, where he says, traditional is the dead ideas of the living, and tradition is the living ideas of the dead. And when I think of the humanities, I think of the way in which the past and the present come together to be able to create new things and innovation, to create forms of thinking about things by actually depending upon the sum of human knowledge over time. And so it's not an issue of the humanities being under attack. It's a need for the humanities to be redefined within the context of a modern society. And the same thing goes with culture. I mean, you know, culture, I guess you could define as a way of life. In traditional ways we see it, but you know, it's also a medium for growing things, like a throat culture of some sort. And it's this balance between, you know, if you just stick with this return to the classics for its own sake without examining new questions or important questions, you're lost. And so I guess my interest in the teaching profession is to support the quality of an education which helps students examine, you know, the living ideas of the dead in a contemporary context, and to appreciate both a way of life and a medium for growing things, and that I think that that's what schools should do in addressing this thing. And I think it has nothing to do with, you know, what Steve Jobs had said, which I still can't figure out.
So, Fred, you said redefine the humanities. Could you expand on that a little bit?
To move away from the humanities as the less, to connect what we've traditionally thought of as the humanities with something that is always relevant. In other words, to consider it something that you need to have as you live and breathe and eat and compute and do whatever you need to do in order to think through something, but not to consider it something like a subject that would be lesser on this big, plate and the tyranny of the urgent all the time in a school. So, to remember, I guess it would be to remember what the humanities were all about rather than just to change the definition.
I think that's right. Here's what concerns me. Of course I believe in the humanities. If I didn't, I wouldn't be sitting on this panel. And I run an organization that is really teaching ethics, values, global perspectives to about 10,000 people a year. So I suspect all of us and most people in this room agree with the underlying premise of the question. But the problem is, as I travel globally, we're not winning this argument. And when we got the questions last week, I asked a lot of people, college presidents, other friends, to give me their own responses. And while I loved every response they gave me, I don't think anybody gave me a response that would be compelling to somebody who didn't already believe in the humanities. And so I think somehow we got to take this question and these answers and find a way to make a more compelling case to people who are really driving education globally. Otherwise, I think we're going to be right, but we're going to continue to lose the argument.
Do you have any thoughts about possible avenues for approaching that?
I don't. I mean, what I'm struck by is when I travel globally, and we've been doing a lot of work with young people in the Gulf and Middle East region who are driving a lot of the civil society projects. And when I meet with them, they don't ever say to me, boy, I really wish World Learning could help us find ways to get more watered down pre-professional training that's going to be outdated in 6 months, which is mostly what they're getting. What they often say is we want more exposure to the world of ideas, to culture, to arts. I think the students know it, but somehow the policymakers and others who are really driving how dollars are being spent don't quite get it.
Thinking about the students, and I think your characterization of the resistance is spot on. Two ideas occur to me. The first one is that almost anything that people are talking about, whether it's in the gossip pages or politically, I teach at Harvard. I started my first class talking about the Harvard cheating scandal, which everybody was talking about, can be used as an inroad. And I think all of us who liked courses in the classics liked them because the teachers could relate them to what was happening today. It wasn't at all, as Fred was saying, frozen. The other thing, though, which is where it ties very much more to what the world that Adam is interacting with, is thinking and writing critically, reading critically, and so on. Everybody thinks that's important. You don't learn that in any course where you're simply memorizing things or simply going through algorithms. The reason I've gotten on such a kick about the liberal arts is because all over the world, people admire the Amhersts and the Yales and the Princetons, and it's not because they teach Shakespeare better. It's because the students, and I was talking to Fred about this earlier, students learn to speak up, to ask good questions, to argue with the text, to argue with the movie or ever. And so I think maybe a better way into the humanities today, or indeed into any subject, is because it helps you to think better, argue better, convince people better, and also, of course, to change your mind. And what's going on at this meeting? I was just talking to Louise. You bump into people you usually wouldn't bump into, and Roy, who I was having lunch with, we probably don't agree about anything politically, but it was a great discussion. And that's part of what liberal arts is about. In a way, maybe we take it too much for granted, and we don't realize, it's like Monsieur Jourdain didn't realize he was talking about prose. For most people, wherever they stand in arts and in politics in this country, if they're educated, they take it for granted, and yet we haven't been able to seal the deal when it comes to curricular things.
So let me try this argument, connecting the question to one of the other panel questions, namely the challenges in education. And I think the humanities, and especially fields like cognitive psychology and the learning sciences, can actually contribute to a better understanding of learning and education in ways that would be really helpful in improving education. It's my strong belief that people don't always have good intuitions about learning and about education. And you might say, well, how can that be? Didn't we all go to school, and aren't we all learning every hour of the day, every minute of the day? Aren't we all experts in learning? But I would answer, well, we all have teeth and we use them every day, but that doesn't make us good dentists. And I think so it is with education. And in fact, cognitive science and the learning sciences have produced some unintuitive findings about learning and education. So it happens, for example, in studies that two groups of people are given two different forms of instruction. And the group that comes away liking their instruction better and thinking they have learned more is actually the group that learned the least of the two. And this is important. And by the way, it's not because they were somehow not smart, but it is because learning is a complex process, and it doesn't always happen with full awareness. Much of it is unconscious, sometimes struggle, which you might think, gee, that didn't help me learn, but sometimes struggle is actually productive.
Could you say more about those two groups? I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive. What exactly was done in the two groups that led one to like it better?
So this was a study in which one group got blocked instruction versus interleaved. So by these terms mean whether you do the same types of problems as a block, and then the block of the next type of problems followed by another block versus rotating through the types. And as you do that, the blocked condition is easier for you, because when you do the next problem, you kind of still remember what you did in the previous problem. The interleaved condition, on the other hand, is harder because each problem is kind of new again, and you sort of have to retrieve from memory what it was, how the solution method. And so that feels more like a struggle as you're doing it versus slightly smoother trajectory. And actually the block condition, I should add, is better for shortly after the condition. So in that sense, if you're cramming for an exam, that might be just the thing to do. But over the long term, it's better to spread out these things. And however, the people who were in this blocked condition thought they learned more, probably because they had an easier experience. And there are lots of other examples of unintuitive findings in education. And so to me, that means that if we base instructional design on our intuitions rather than on solid science, we might be led astray, and we might actually end up with things that aren't so good, and that could have been a lot better if we had done the hard work. So my argument here is that the humanities, and in particular cognitive psychology and the learning sciences, can sort of bring scientific rigor and hopefully some healthy skepticism to questions about learning and education. And I can give a number of other examples of the same ilk.
I think that was a very interesting example you gave, and it reminds me of my experience in the world of chess. And I always tell my students that if it felt easy, it means you didn't learn as much as you should have. If you felt it was difficult, you struggled, that means we did the right job. So it definitely relates to me.
I think, just to add to that, for me, my greatest frustration about education, I know this isn't the question you asked yet, but to answer it anyways, when I travel globally, and even when I travel in the US and I watch the way we're teaching, we continue to teach the way we've been teaching for the last 2,000 years. Despite the fact that we have more and more data from the cognitive sciences and other sciences that suggest that most people just aren't hot-wired to learn that way. And somehow we have to find a way to bridge the gap between the science of learning, which has come a long way in the last 10 or 15 years, and what's actually going on in classrooms, which remains remarkably unchanged.
Well, let me pose a problem, which is actually one that I'm wrestling with myself. And that is because while I certainly would never throw away data or ignore it, I do believe that a lot of the benefits of liberal arts education play out over the long run and not immediately. And indeed, I would love if there were a study done with people 5 or 10 years after school is over, what they take away and what they remember. So here's the thing. Because I am an empiricist, a couple of times I've actually given post-tests in my class for which the class wasn't particularly prepared. And in both times, I've been disappointed with the results. There was much less pickup than I thought. But then I faced the following dilemma. I know I can get a better response on a post-test if I structure the curriculum such that we're practicing those things every week. But there are lots of other things which I want to do which I would then have to sacrifice in order to get the team having a higher mean score. How do people think about that issue? Am I fooling myself by saying there are longer-term benefits, say, in having wide-range discussions rather than having a prep session each week? Because in a sense, when you get away from rather algorithmic subjects, that's the choice you have to make.
Which is particularly relevant for the humanities here, which
Yes.
is not exactly an algorithmic subject, set of subjects.
What do you think, Steve?
I'm the moderator here.
Well,
Try to keep myself in a different role.
well, living with my college students for a number of years now, I know that many of the students prepare for exams and tend to forget it the next day. So it depends what the subject is. If it's something that really interests them, they'll probably remember it because they follow up reading about it or practicing it or whatnot. However, on other topics that they just have to pass the exam and they'll tend to forget about. I think it largely depends how really interested they are on the topic.
Can we make them interested? I don't mean force them, but to what extent have we got some latitude about that?
Well, obviously, you can try, but not everybody will be interested in one particular topic, even though they have to do it in order to get their degree, even if that may not be their majors in particular. Obviously, if that is their major and that's their specific interest, they hopefully are interested and they remember. But we have to learn so many other things also in addition to our particular major in order to get a degree. So I don't think you can force everybody to be equally passionate about every subject in
Yeah,
school.
of course, one inference that one could make is that the people who plan curricula as a whole ought to spend a lot more time thinking about whether the whole is going to be less or greater than the sum of its parts.
That is a beautiful segue to the next question I wanted to raise, which is about curriculum. So we've been starting to nibble around the edges of this. Why don't we just dive into it? If you were designing a K-12 curriculum for the 21st century from scratch, what would you include in it? And what aspects of the current standard curriculum would you not include? What sorts of activities should take place in the classroom? And what sorts should take place outside of school? So the Khan Academy, Khan is talking about reversing the venues where the kids should do the lecture material at home. They can watch the internet, get the material, and come into the classroom and do homework, as it were, together in groups where they have the advantage of an expert, the teacher, to help them if they get stuck. That resonates with a lot of people, but that's just one example. So the big question is, if you're designing a curriculum from scratch for the 21st century, what sorts of things would you include in it? And what sorts of things that are currently included would you not include? Let's focus on that. Vincent.
Well, so for new skills, I would include things like creativity and innovation. This actually came up in the panel that was just before lunch here. Teamwork skills, communication and critical thinking were mentioned. And critically, I would also include skills that help people be better learners. And I can give reasons for all of these. Creativity, it just seems important in so many jobs. Non-creative jobs are disappearing. Teamwork, so much happens in teams, so why not get our students started really early? And it's not always easy to work in teams, especially if the teams are interdisciplinary and have people from multiple backgrounds. So research definitely shows that people, when they work with other people from different backgrounds, like their work less, but they actually produce better results. So very interesting, but also a reason that we need to help our students learn teamwork. And in the area, and relatedly, by communication, I mean things, not just things like communicating clearly and being able to make good arguments and back them up, but also sort of being able to disagree productively without flame wars starting. So in other words, being able to take advantage of the diversity of viewpoints. And finally, given that what you know, your skills and knowledge today are likely to be out of date, well, maybe not tomorrow, but possibly next week, it's really important that people have the ability and the confidence that they can come up to speed in new areas very quickly. And I do believe, although you cannot teach all of that, I certainly believe that there are skills that can help across domains. And some of those are actually quite simple recommendations, such as asking yourself questions before you read a piece of instructional material, try to explain it to yourself. People actually learn better when they explain things to themselves than when they're being explained to, even by experts, and things like this. So those would be, that would be my list.
Yeah, for me, I would focus a lot more on the last half of what you said than the first half. In other words, I would focus a lot less on what we teach and a lot more on how we actually teach it. For me, we have limited amount of policy time and focus and resources, and I think we need to start with, essentially start all over with how we're teaching kids in K through 12 settings. It needs to be more active, it needs to be more engaged, it needs to be more team-based, more problem-based. I think if we just dealt with that, and I think that's the interesting thing about the Khan Academy. It's not that they're trying to teach the content differently, but they've totally turned upside down and backwards actually how kids are being taught.
Is it effective, by the way? Has anybody measured? Do we know if the Khan approach is actually better in some sense than the traditional?
The Khan? You're talking about Khan Academy?
Yeah.
So the Khan approach being
Where they get the lectures
get
at
the
home.
lecture at home.
But I think what's interesting is I don't think there's a Khan approach right now. I think if you look across the education space, what's interesting is the way it's giving teachers a tool to innovate in a variety of different ways. And so when I talk to teachers using the Khan Academy, there's not one cookie cutter way that they're actually using it, but it's clearly giving them a tool to teach in ways that they know they should be teaching, but just haven't been able to in the past for all kinds of reasons.
This is teaching technological sorts of materials. Just looping back to the previous question, is this approach going to be useful for humanities as well?
Khan is actually invading the humanities. That may not be the best verb, but art history and so on. I think there actually are not data, but I'm sure Gates will secure data. There are data, Vince may know them better than I do, about distance learning. I mean, a lot more people start than stop, but if it's a good distance learning approach, people like it, and they do as well, by and large, as people who are in the classroom. But it's statistics and computer science stuff. I don't think anybody's even thought about looking at it in a more softer social science or humanistic sense. And again, the outcome variables are going to be crucial there. What is it that you're looking for? If, as Vincent said, it's the quality of questions that you ask, then I wouldn't bet too much on the Khan Academy. Khan Academy is very much, there's an authority and he's telling you what it is that you should know. But it'll get smarter.
I'm not super familiar with the research on learning from video lectures, but I think there have been some findings that watching a lecture on video is actually better, and for the simple reason that you can pause the video and then think and even back up when you realize that you're not tracking. And so from that point of view, although I don't know, you asked, is there research showing that video lectures first and then practical work in the classroom? I don't know of any research, but I'd put my money on that is more effective.
Fred?
I'd like to echo what Adam said about the how. But if you asked the question, so if it's fantasy land and I don't have a test at the end, I can answer this question? Well, this morning we heard this wonderful talk from UNESCO. And in that talk, I was reminded of something that is completely different than what I was planning on saying. And that is that, there was this 1978 study UNESCO produced called Learning the Treasure Within. It was a great study. And it was, they had that learning, or the structure of the curriculum, should be designed around 4 pillars. Learning to be, learning to do, learning to know, and learning to live together. Be, do, know, live together. And in this study, they talked about schools, or the permeable boundary between schools and the community. And I began to think about Khan Academy and all these other things, which I think should flourish in this notion of learning to be, do, know, live together. Learning to be was UNESCO's #1 choice as a curriculum. In other words, kids knowing about who they are, where they come from, and what groups they're affiliated with. It was all about cultural centers. So I would actually redesign school around 4 notions such as these, and include the school itself as part of that curriculum, where the kids would show up every day and they'd cook and they'd clean for each other to start this community off on the right foot. And then learning to be, do, know, live together could be divided up by grade levels, but kids would fan out into the community, learning to, and again, this is fantasy land, right? But I
It's
believe
also
in
John
it.
Dewey.
What's that?
It's John Dewey.
Yeah, well, learning to be would, go out into cultural centers, learning to do, going out into work centers, learning to know, skills centers, learning to live together, community centers. And I see all the time schools building facilities when a movie theater is empty during the day. And so maybe it's John Dewey meets Buckminster Fuller, where there's a kind of way in which the very engagement of the community resources address an issue of practical nature, humanities and sciences, by connecting this to things that have been durable values that societies have held for quite some time.
A lot of excellent ideas. I have my own, and I'd like to talk about my passion, and that has been chess all my life. And I think if there is one subject that should be added to the curriculums all around the country or all around the world, I think it's chess. Certainly not with the goal to create or build champions in the millions. Absolutely not. However, I believe that chess teaches everyone to think critically, to analyze, and come up with solutions, with decisions. And what do we do in our lives day after day, from early in the morning when we wake up and get dressed, making decisions, resolving problems? And what do we do during a chess game naturally? During an average game, we make 30, 40, 50 decisions, good or bad, and then we learn from our experience. So we have just built in a normal chess game all this thinking process that is becoming natural for any chess player. And I think especially in the lowest grades, kindergarten through second grade, I think it would be an absolutely fantastic tool to improve education, improve the learning habits of all children, because they can use it in every subject and then later on in their lives. Making decisions, analyze, and being responsible for your actions are basic life skills that are extremely useful. What are the benefits? All children like to play. Okay? So while if you would add up another subject that's learning and homework and all of that, they say, oh no, another thing. Here they are learning, so they'll do it, for the most part, with great pleasure, that everybody wants to play. The other great thing about chess is, in the practical sense, that it's very cost-effective. It's very inexpensive for all schools. Every school can afford to buy a chess set and a chessboard that you can get well under $10 a set and lasts many, many years. So I think chess definitely should be added to the curriculum in the United States. It is in many schools, but I think it should be in all the schools, like it is in a number of countries around the world, like, for example, Armenia or Moldova or a number of other countries. Chess is a mandatory subject, just like math or language or history or other subjects are. So I think this is something for our educational system to think about more seriously and take advantage of it, because I think the benefits are tremendous.
So how do the educators on the panel feel about having chess as a mandatory topic? Howard, you were about to respond, I believe.
That was the one thing I was going to duck. I don't want to get into an argument with Susan. I think there probably are a number of ways in which the things that are accomplished by chess could be accomplished by other games or by music or athletics. But I don't want to have that argument, because I want to answer your question, if that's okay. I think the panel, including Susan, has given excellent responses, and I would endorse them all, and I'm not going to repeat them. But I do think that there is a reason why we've had school all over the world, elementary and then secondary school, for many, many years. And that's because there are things which young people are not going to learn on their own. One is the 3 R's, and while some people can crack the code on their own, we know that even at elite colleges, young people do not know how to read critically, how to understand argument, persuasion, rhetoric, and so on. And at an elite college, which everybody here would know, now at Harvard, they have found that courses teaching kids how to read, in what I will call for shorthand the University of Chicago way, what Wayne Booth, Mortimer Adler, and Stephen Toulmin wrote about are things that kids are hungry for because they don't really know how to read something that's longer than a tweet. The other thing, I'm being a little bit precious there, the other thing is the great disciplinary achievements of human beings, thinking scientifically, thinking historically, thinking mathematically, and even thinking artistically, are not intuitive. And you need to spend real time to get over the stereotypical thinking and the simplistic thinking, which is what the airwaves, particularly the cable airwaves, fill us with. And it took a long time to develop the scientific method. It took a long time to develop history, not simply as stories. And if it doesn't happen in schools, the thought that it's going to happen on its own is, I think that's a pipe dream. But I would want to end just by echoing what Fred said. If we lived in another kind of world, we could expect ideas about community and ethics and morality to develop outside of school, but there's almost nowhere in the world anymore where if it doesn't develop in the school's community, it's going to develop. And that's probably more important than anything else if we're going to live together on a planet.
So you've all added things that you think would be profitably included in the curriculum, and it's hard to argue with anything I've heard. But the other part of the question was what should be dropped. So if you want to add a lot of new things, you might really want to think about whether some of the current things that are taught, which have been taught for hundreds of years in some cases, might want to either be dropped or transformed into something slightly different. Any thoughts on that, Adam?
So I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, so I'm for dropping nothing and having them in school 7 days a week, including Friday and Saturday nights and Saturday mornings. And I'll pay extra taxes for it. You know, I want to tell a story that actually answers this question and builds on something Howard just said. So I hope the TV cameras are local. I have a daughter who took an AP history class last year. So the best kids in the high school are the kids most interested in history. And the teacher made the decision to teach about a quarter of American history, which meant that none of those kids had any chance at all of passing the AP exam. None. But what they really did learn is they learned how to think. Because he took a couple key periods and didn't really make a difference what they were, and he had them in groups, he had them out of the classroom, he had them doing research, a lot of the kinds of things the panelists are talking about. And at the end of the year, he had a lot of angry kids who didn't do well in the AP exam and a lot of angry parents. But he also had a lot of young people who I know pretty well who had learned how to think, how to argue, how to debate. They learned a whole lot of skills that they weren't learning anywhere else in high school. So for me, I actually would be happy if they removed half of the content from all the classes they're teaching in the high schools, and I don't really care what the half is, because they'll find the content on they'll Google it.
I think you're absolutely right. For what I talked about, it doesn't matter what the content, I mean, you can study any history to learn to think historically, you can study any kind of science. Then when you want to go on to college and graduate school, if you want to be a geneticist, fine. The cultural literacy, which became very popular here, E.D. Hirsch's work, is well motivated, but the notion we sit in school and memorize, as he said, 5,000 essential facts is just ridiculous because it's in the phone. The kid was right.
So am I hearing that at least some of the panel suggesting we randomly drop half of the curriculum? Is that really what you think? Randomly, not focusing on some things more than others? Vincent, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, I didn't suggest randomly dropping anything. I thought the suggestion was to just drop half of every subject, but I'm going to say that schools, the challenge that many schools face is that kids cannot read, write, and do basic math. So those we cannot drop, in my opinion. We need to keep those. And that maybe doesn't leave much room for cutting. So I'm not sure I have any real winning recommendations here. I could see actually exchanging algebra for computer programming, for example. since that might actually be a more practical skill. Like when's the last time you used algebra? Does anybody remember? No.
Or
So-
statistics.
When we have to
right?
reteach it to our kids.
Well, yeah. When you
That's
help
right.
your kids with homework, yeah. Statistics, well, that may also be more practical than algebra. So
You know, statistics, I think many more people need statistics and balancing their books than need certainly higher algebra 2.
And I think some computer programming skill, although that can, I think, also help with the humanities, oddly enough, in a number of different ways. One is simply by sort of bringing stuff to the internet that has some programming, but is really about topics in the humanities or about self-expression, like so some forms of using new media for arts. Actually, game design and game development is something that kids tend to be excited about, or robotics programming. Well, robotics probably goes a little further away from the humanities, but game design sort of brings together art and computer science. So that could work well too, and might actually lead to greater enthusiasm on the part of our middle school and high school students.
So let me loop back to chess for just a second.
Yes.
Should all kids be taught the same things, and should they be taught in the same way? We have technology now that gives us much more flexibility for individualizing teaching in a way that simply wasn't possible before. So when you think about the number of topics that could be taught, it's more than 7 days a week. So you're led to ask the question, should everybody beyond some basic foundational material be learning the same thing? Who would decide what they learn? Should it just be them? Should they be taught in the same way? What are your views on that, those kinds of questions?
Well, I don't think anybody's going to defend the idea of having to teach it in the same way anymore. Would they? I mean, it seems to be completely unnecessary. And you know, the digital media allow us to present things in many ways, and I can't see any downside to that. If you ask me about what do we need commonly, I think that for the ways of thinking that I talked about, we don't need anything in common. What I would say we need in common is some understanding of our government and our history, and you know, underscoring what Fred said, what it means to live civilly, respectfully with other people. I mean, you know, when half a class at Harvard College cheats, I get pretty concerned. What's the message? That was for the cameras, by the way.
Can I add one thing here? Because I wanted to answer that first question. There were about 6 afterwards, so I worry about that. I would actually I wouldn't drop the subjects. I would drop all the textbooks. I'd can those right off the bat. And that would throw so much disarray into the system that people would then look at these subjects. This is, of course, if tests were kept the same, and we have to, I mean, if that question about what you would take out means that the same test is there, you'd have, and if it is, then I would definitely drop all the textbooks, but not trash the test because it is some monster, but try to get students to get there somehow. Because really, I don't think the testing, you know, the toothpaste is going to go back into the tube. I think it's just escalating beyond, you know, anybody's capacity to deal with it in a classroom. But if you got rid of the textbooks, I bet you'd get there in a very interesting way. And chess, in my opinion, as I've seen around the world, could very well be a thing that you do in its place. And I would also take time from the day, even with these same subjects, and create a structure by which students would have to learn, master, teach each other, reflect upon it, and you know, be a little bit more the center of attention.
I agree that I think it's important to be flexible in the tools on how to learn, and there should be obviously a curricula to follow, but whether it's from a book or through digital media or bringing in lecturers or whatever creative form that works, I think it should be supported and allowed.
On the question of whether chess should be taught, I'd like to point out sort of a slight inconsistency between something Howard said and something Susan said, which is that Howard was disappointed that after his course, his students couldn't answer certain questions that he had prepared. He didn't tell us how those questions related to what was actually being taught in the course. But you could see this as sort of a failure of the course or the students or the teacher to affect what cognitive scientists would call transfer. In other words, he had expected that what he taught would prepare the students for some activity or some knowledge or connections that they weren't able to make. In other words, what he taught in the course didn't transfer. And I think you could ask the same question about chess. Like, okay, certainly chess is a sort of a very challenging mental endeavor. But you could ask to what areas do we expect the skills that we teach and that kids learn as they learn chess? To what areas other than chess do we expect to see improvement? And following my point that cognitive psychology and learning sciences should be a basis for education, I think you could approach that scientifically and simply try to answer that by measuring.
Well, there have been a number of studies, and they all shown that chess has helped children compared to other extracurricular activities significantly in math, which is known, but also in reading and writing skills. Because unlike what most people think, that chess is largely about memorization and calculation, actually I believe it's a lot more about pattern recognition. So therefore, even when we're talking about reading or writing, we're thinking in patterns, thinking in plans. So the thinking process is what I think is important that chess can teach to children, not the knight f6 and queen d5, obviously. And therefore, I say that I only think it's important for kids to learn those skills early on, kindergarten, first, second grade, and then only the ones who are interested, they can continue on a hobby or on a competitive basis. So I don't think they should have it all K through 12. No, I think that's going in the wrong direction. But in those initial years, when it's important to engage children in something that they perceive as a playing, as a game, I think it's a wonderful way to teach them ideas about learning, the thought process, and even scientific methods, the things that we use in chess naturally, and they don't look at it like science, but it's the same methods that we're using to develop those skills.
Thank you. Let me ask a question of Susan, because as I mentioned, I had lunch with Roy, and he believes exactly what you believe, but he believes it about music. Is that right? So
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there is a big difference with music. Chess, you can buy a chess set and board for under $10, while buying a violin or piano is a little more costly.
Fair enough. Yeah, but I'm.
Other than that, I agree. Music is just as great.
I'm bringing this up because I think we have the issue of which sorts of things are intrinsically worthwhile, which sorts of things have transfer, and even if they do, and I'm willing to accept for the sake of argument that chess might have some transfer and music might have some transfer, why do they have transfer? And it's interesting to know, in both cases, maybe because you got kids excited about something and passionate, and it may have much less to do with whether it's how does the rook move or what's a B flat. But this is the area of cognitive studies, and it's well worth going down that way, because as Steve points out, there's so much we could do, and relatively speaking, there's so little time. We want to make the most judicious decisions that we can.
You go into most classrooms and you see a whole lot of people, especially boys, desperately trying to do anything to keep from falling asleep. You rarely see somebody playing the violin and fall asleep. Listeners maybe, but not the players.
Let me switch gears one more time. We're going to leave at least 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So let's see if we can do at least one more of these big questions. We just saw the end of a massive teachers' strike in one of the nation's largest school systems. I think it was the third largest school system, Chicago. Many of the issues centered in one way or another on job security for the teachers. Do the challenges facing teachers match those facing students, facing their parents, and facing the nation as a whole? Are the agendas aligned? And if not, in what ways are they not? And what are the likely consequences of such misalignment? What can be done with respect to the actual institutions that are in place to try to implement some of the kinds of things we've been talking about and other people in the community have been talking about for a long time?
Well, since there's a few seconds of silence, the most important book that I read in education the last few years, and I think I probably tripled the sales of the book, is Pasi Sahlberg's book, Finnish Lessons, which is probably known to the panelists. Finland was nowhere in education 40 years ago, and now by every criterion, it's at the top. What Sahlberg points out in this book is if you list what he calls the Anglo-American consensus, the nickname he calls it the germ theory of education, and you list the assumptions of what are being done out of Washington and out of London, Finland does exactly the opposite on each one of them and ends up being number one. Sahlberg is a very smart guy. He doesn't say we should do what Finland does or Singapore, which are the other one, and they're quite different in what they do. He says, don't assume that the answers coming out of Washington and of London are necessarily the right answers. But to give a more direct answer to your question, unless teaching is professionalized and an attractive profession, we're just going to be rearranging deck chairs. I think Teach for America is terrific. There are critics of it, but it's not going to solve a problem when you have 50 million students. And we don't hesitate to spend trillions of dollars on wars if we really wanted to have a significantly better educational system and not the frustrations on all sides in Chicago that we saw in Chicago, we would have to make it a real national priority.
I may certainly, I agree with that and would argue it's not just a Chicago problem, it's just not a US problem, it's a global problem. I think that one of the, probably the greatest challenge we face globally around education is we need better ways and more strategic ways of recruiting, training, retaining, and developing good teachers. I mean, it doesn't matter where you go, you can be in Ethiopia or Chicago or Brattleboro, Vermont, where you have really high quality, well-supported teachers, you have education going on. Where you don't, you don't. And I think the key word that you used that I would echo is institution. The institutions of education don't support teachers very well. And there's too many incentives for people not to go into the profession, not to stay in the profession. And if they do those two things to not get the training and redevelopment they need to stay good. We just have to do better by our teachers.
My daughter teaches third grade math, and she's got a bunch of kids. I mean, she's got a gazillion kids in her class, and she's a very good teacher. But she's got a community of teachers that keep high standards for each other. She's become somewhat obsessive, I have to say, because that's all that she and her friends do is talk about the kids. But she has one thing, and she's exhausted. She works 12 to 15 hours a day at this thing and is always around for her kids. With a single factor, she says, I'm exhausted, but I have to say, and I just want to get out of here, but I have to say I kind of love it because I love my principal. That the guy works as hard as she does, and that he's there before she's there, and he leaves after there, and he gathers them together, and they think as a community, and they support each other, and they give each other all their stuff, and that there's a kind of scaled intimacy because it's spreading throughout the community, and it was a function of the school leader or these school principals. And Adam says it, and Howard, in your work, you've said this time and time again, that these kind of skilled teachers that form communities and are able to address issues will probably end up at the negotiating table, not so much as a protection of rights, but what's in the best interest of the kids, because there's such a powerful culture in that school that they won't let anybody slip, and it was a function of that school principal.
I totally agree that I think the team spirit is really, really, really important in learning. And I know it was said earlier, I guess semi-jokingly, that maybe they should come in and cook for each other and clean for each other. But doing things together, whatever it may be, I think is a very key ingredient to success. And I can tell you, as a coach of a chess team that wins national championships or in other things, that doing things together, being there for each other, builds and creates success.
Maybe one way in which teachers' interests and students' interests are not very well aligned is in the area of standardized tests, where you might say the students' interests or their goals is to learn deeply and learn with understanding. And whereas teachers know that they'll be held accountable for the test results, and not just them, but their schools, and which often creates a pressure to get their students ready for standardized tests. And so you see teachers spending lots of time just preparing their students for the standardized test. And I've met a teacher who said, well, yeah, I don't prepare for the standardized tests. I teach my students the skills that they need for those tests the whole year round. And I think that's actually a perfect example of how to approach a test, but it's not how it typically works out in practice. I don't know a solution for this, except to say that maybe as more and more technology moves into the schools, which captures lots of data about student learning, it may be possible to use that data instead of the standardized tests. And there is actually some research showing from Massachusetts that data from intelligent tutoring systems, which are systems that students use to practice math problems, that data from the 8th grade predict the 10th grade MCAS, the Massachusetts standardized state test, just as well as the 8th grade MCAS. So I think that's where we should be going, and it also takes the stress away from just having to perform on one day. I mean, you would all be insulted as if your performance was judged just on the basis of a 35-minute performance.
So I don't want to have the performance of the panelists be judged by the last comments they make, but I'd like to go through the panelists one at a time very quickly so we can get to questions from the audience and answer a simple question. If you had to pick one change that you'd make in the educational system moving forward, what would that one change be? So let's just quickly go down the line, then we'll turn to you. So Howard?
I would triple the salaries of teachers so that you could get people who would be willing to stay in the profession. And I have to say, Steve, I think, I have to leave in a couple minutes, so I may not be able to be here till the end. Excuse me.
Well, you foresaw that I would want to make many changes, but just to pick one, I think the development of educational games, which have the potential not just to make learning more joyful and capitalize on sort of student enthusiasm and motivation, but also have the potential to put students in situations where they have to explore different perspectives, something that is very important in the humanities, is promising. Although I hope we'll also be a little skeptical about claims about those games and ask for scientific evidence.
I'd focus entirely on teacher leaders, namely principals.
I think it's important to focus on teaching students how to think and how to solve problems, and chess can be a solution to that.
I'd focus on pedagogy and move completely away from passive learning and passive teaching to active group learning.
Okay. Thank you very much, panelists. Now let's turn to the audience. We'll start and just work across.
Question for the panel. I think everyone
There's a microphone.
I think everyone agrees that we all want to make schools better. But how do we know when a school is better? What parameters do we measure? What don't we measure? And second part of the question is, would it be okay, or why is it not okay to allow schools to compete on providing that measure?
I just want to repeat something Howard said, because I thought it was really smart, and I don't think, and I want to make sure everybody heard it. I don't know what the answer is, but I know what it isn't. I wouldn't measure whatever the outcomes are at the end of the school year or the end of high school. I would measure it 10 years out, 15 years out, 20 years out. 20, 30 years out, how good of a job are our high schools doing, producing the citizens, the community members, the labor force, everything we need, the kind of human beings we need to keep society healthy.
There's a very important research which was summarized by Sandy Jenks on this topic. It turns out that the people who end up getting married, having jobs, staying out of jail are not the people who had the highest test scores, but the people who went to schools which had some stability. And even people like Jim Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, are becoming very interested in what are now called non-cognitive skills, but I would call them different, more grit kinds of things, which we've all read about.
Hi, my name is Daniel Fountainberry, and I run a children's publishing and educational software company. I have a question directed towards Dr. Alevin and Dr. Gardner. I'm specifically interested to get your perspective on the kinds of technologies that are being developed within human-computer interactions, machine learning, adaptive hypermedia systems that publishers can use to start creating more effective, adaptive materials and curriculum tools. So just from your perspective, what are the kind of technologies that have now proven themselves effective through research that publishers should look to integrate into their content?
Well, I've been doing a lot of work in intelligent tutoring systems, which function, have some aspects of human tutor, so they help students with complex problem solving, as you do in many areas in school. They have been used much in mathematics, for example, but also in other areas. And this technology has made it out into schools and is being used in about 3,000 schools in the country. And one reason it's effective is because it just follows students step by step as they solve problems. They can solve problems in their own ways, and the software can follow them. Another reason is, so they get lots of help just at the point that they need it, and not at the end of the problem, which may be a long way after they sort of went off the right path, and also if they were doing homework on paper, they don't get it 3 days later. So they get it when they need it. But the other thing is that these systems are capable of collecting data as they go and individualize instruction accordingly, so they can select problems that address particular students' strengths and weaknesses. And this has been quite effective, and I think this technology is quite ready to be more widespread.
Yeah, I would underscore what Vincent said, that individualizing education is one of the important things we can do with technology. The other thing, the most powerful idea that I've encountered recently is the idea of connected learning. Kids learn things in school, they do social media at home, they do things in the community, games, religion, whatever, and typically these are spaces which don't connect to one another. And I think the people involved in education who can help kids connect things, not just in terms of their day, but in terms of the transfer in their brains, will be an incredible boon. And while I don't hold any particular pro or con versus the publishing sector, if you can find ways to help make kids connect the dots, that would be fantastic.
And another way in which technology helps is simply because it produces so much data, which can be mined for insights into student learning. And this is a challenging problem, so there's a whole new research field called educational data mining. But some people argue that this will be the greatest impact that technology is going to have on education. I'm not sure I totally agree, but anyway, that argument has been made.
Yeah, I have
The microphone's not working.
I think that maybe we should ask ourselves, what is the end results that we're expecting? So what do we need in our world today? And what should we be teaching the children accordingly? We know that robots are going to take a lot of jobs. They have. So what will a robot be able to do in 20 years from now or in other words, what can we do that the robot cannot do in 20 years from now? And then start drawing up the sort of the strategy of education. And what I still feel, I spoke about it in my introduction, it's the development of the senses. And I think that in humanities, I think that emotions and development of your senses and being aware of things to be more creative is really very, very important, and putting things in context. Those dots are very important, connecting the dots. And strategic thinking. I mean, Susan's been here as a guest for the last few years, and it's not by luck. I believe that chess is very important. My children played chess when they were small. And I think that, you know, sailing and tactics and strategic positioning of a ball on a tennis court and all those things are important. So, but at the end of the day, I think creativity is the most important. So how do we convert our children to be more creative? And that is not obvious. And I think that our education should not be about reporting what is obvious and reporting what's in a textbook, because the children are going to be much smarter at one point than the teachers, because they have their dictionary right online. So you're going to board them. So the question is to not board them. It's to put things in context and to make them think about the unknown, to make them think about what is invisible, and to make them create. That's the tough job, and that is not obvious. So the question is, how do we teach the teacher to see the invisible if they don't see it?
Oh, go, you can handle it. That's fantastic.
Well, I'll go first so that I don't have to go last. Actually, this connects very nicely to the discussion that we had in the earlier panel here, where also the suggestion was made that we teach kids much earlier than we do now to be innovators and to be creative. And that panel consisted of people from design and architecture, which in their educational systems, I think, have many ways of rewarding innovation and creativity. They have some methods to teach. I sometimes watch Project Runway with my wife, and which is all about creativity and creativity under great time pressure, but it also strikes me that the critiquing that goes on is very brutal. And critiquing being one way in which the creative disciplines foster learning, I think. So we'd have to find a way of doing that in a more palatable way with young kids. But I do think that if teachers were to reward innovation and risk-taking and encourage kids to, they already like to fail in video games, but now also not in video games, like take risks, and just make it clear that that the standards are innovation and not giving the right answer. That's,
you know, just to add one thing that I think some of the most interesting work going on in this area is actually teachers are focusing more on civic education and getting students outside the classroom, working with peers who they would normally not work with, getting them outside their comfort zones to really do problem-based learning, often cross-class, cross-age, cross-everything. I actually think a lot of teachers get this, but I think they're stuck in school systems that don't actually allow them to teach this way. That's my greatest concern.
I would like to address the issue of emotional and social and physical safety in schools as a precondition for creativity. Because of Classic being tossed from high school at least 3 times and having become a principal in spite of that, I was tossed for reading. There was a textbook, and on the left-hand side was Lolita, and on the other side I had a little textbook of the Communist Manifesto. And I kept on not responding to teachers' questions, but I was reading Lolita and the Communist Manifesto instead. And the issue was that I always felt unsafe in school, unsafe to explore an idea. And I'm spending all of my time and energy and career working in areas of bullying and peace education and earthquake science and safety, so schools can be places in which kids can take those intellectual risks. Because I don't think schools, as a matter of course, conspire against creativity. But I do think that the structure when you walk in the room and how you feel and what you do and what you learn can be done in enormously creative ways, but we do set up these obstacles in our way that prevent a pretty fertile mind from exploring things, and that when you do open up that avenue and it feels safe, enormously positive things happen. And I've seen this in Baltimore, and I've seen this in, in Bolivia. I mean, wherever you go, this is an issue that parents want. They want the school not to collapse and their kids in Port-au-Prince or in, in Chengdu. They want safe environments. And somehow, if people get a sense of that safety, I think it's bound with creativity. And just, it's a thing that has just been dominating my points of view for quite some time.
Well, it doesn't take any creativity on my part or anybody else's to see that we have had a privilege here to have such fertile minds to interact and discuss these big issues concerning education in the future. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'm sure all the panelists who are here will be happy to take additional questions one-on-one afterwards. And I thank you very much for your interest and attention. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.